Hello, I'm Greg Hunter. Thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com. One of my favorite interview guests, Paul Craig Roberts. He was a former assistant Treasury secretary under the Reagan administration. And when I say assistant, that's not somebody who gets coffee or picks up dry cleaning. He was number 2 at Treasury, and he handled all monetary policy for the United States of America. So he's a big deal, and he's here to talk about the enormity and the problem of this giant Libor rate rigging scandal. Dr. Roberts, thank you for joining us today. Tell us, is this a really big deal that most people aren't really grasping?
It's a pretty big deal, but there's much more to it than the spin that's been put on it for the public. It's true the banks were benefiting from lending to one another at lower overnight rates, but this was not the real reason for fixing the rate low, and it's not the real impact of fixing the rate low. When you fix the overnight borrowing rate, the London overnight borrowing rate low, what you're doing is affecting the prices of all debt instruments that have floating rates, because most of those floating rate instruments are based off Libor. And as you know, Greg, the price of the debt instrument moves in the opposite direction from the interest rate. So a low interest rate means a high price of the debt instrument, whereas a high interest rate means a low price of the debt instrument. And so the real import of the lower Libor rate was to boost the values of the debt instruments on the bank's books that have floating rates, like collateral debt obligations,
Mortgage-backed securities,
or any asset-backed security, any asset-backed instrument. So what the scandal does is it makes the banks look more solvent than they are. But it's only one small part of the overall rigging, because the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England have known about this for years. I mean, the Federal Reserve has known about it since 2008.
The Federal Reserve, I hate to interrupt you, but the Federal Reserve is making out like, well, they tried to do something about it. And in fact, they did not, did they?
And of course, why would they want to do something about it? Because their policy is low interest rates. And that's also the policy of the Bank of England, because the low interest rates are necessary to keep these massive banks that they let get too big. They're too big to fail because the consequences are enormous. So it's the policy of the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England to have low interest rates. So why would they object to something that helps the interest rates be low? They don't. So obviously, no, they didn't try to do anything about it because they're doing the same thing themselves. That's what the Fed is doing, fixing the rates low. And when the banks do this, it simply helps that process along. And that's not all the banks are doing, Greg. Also, the banks sell interest rate swaps, because that's a way of shorting interest rates and driving them down. If you sell an interest rate swap, it means you are betting that interest rates would go down, because what you do is you tell the buyer, okay, I'll pay a floating rate, but you pay me the existing fixed rate. So it's a bet the rates are going down. If you sell enough of those, you force the rates down. And as has been made clear, of all the trillions and trillions of dollars in derivatives, 80% of them are interest rate swaps. So, for example, JP Morgan, I think, has $70 trillion of derivatives on its books, and 80% are interest rate swaps. So that is another way that the banks help the central banks keep the interest rates down. There are charts available online that show that every now and then the markets get wary of buying ever more debt from the United States, for example, from the Treasury, when the interest rates on the debt are negative. What do you want to buy 10, 20-year bonds, 30-year bonds at a negative interest rate?
In other words, the interest rate paid will not keep up with inflation.
That's right. And when debt is pouring out, now, you know, if the debt was shrinking, you might do that, expecting to make capital gains on the bonds. But with new debt pouring out constantly, the interest rates less than inflation, that is, you're not getting a real rate of interest. Every now and then, the prices of those bonds start to rise, and interest rates start to creep up. And every time that happens, there's massive intervention. They sell huge amounts of interest rate swaps. So you have to look at this as this is just the banks cooperating with the central bank's policy of maintaining low interest rates.
But isn't this criminal fraud? I mean, somebody pays for that. The people who bought bonds, corporate bonds, who want to get a higher interest rate, the people that bought mortgage-backed securities that should have gotten more interest. I mean, isn't that being that this low interest rate policy being paid for by certain investors, people who bought interest rate swaps that thought interest rates could have and should have gone up? Didn't these people all get beat out of their money? I mean, this is a huge scandal.
Well, let me give you a deeper view of that. Yes, it's a scandal, and yes, people who bought interest rate swaps were hurt. I think that included some municipalities, and I think also depositors were hurt because they got less interest on their accounts.
These people are all going to want to sue, are they not? I mean, this is big money.
They may want to, but let me tell you what. And in fact, if they do, the banks will settle, and if the banks don't have any money, the Fed will give it to them, because that's not important to the Fed, because what's important is the regime of low interest rates. And let's suppose not only do the banks get sued by people on the losing side of this transaction, but let's suppose Congress starts all kinds of hearings and prosecution threatening, and that this spreads beyond the banks to the central banks themselves, because they are complicit in this policy. They knew about it and didn't tell. And remember, they cleaned out the football coaches at Penn State on the grounds that they knew something and didn't tell. So this could then all of a sudden happen to the Fed, to the Bank of England. And suppose they are faced with threats of the Justice Department coming and asking questions. What they'll do, they'll tell Congress and they'll tell Parliament, oh, so you want us to let interest rates go up? You want Goldman Sachs to fail, J.P. Morgan to fail, Bank of America to fail, Citibank to fail?
What you're saying then is we have to have fraud in the economy.
Just wait a minute. You want this to happen? You're so concerned about fraud that you want to destroy the values of all the bonds in the country? The minute those interest rates go up, the loss to people is going to just dwarf the interest rate loss.
And so you're saying that they're going to say we have to have fraud in the economy to survive. We have to have a world of fraud so the banks, heaven forbid, that they go out of business, that they don't go out of business. Well, so we need them so bad.
It's very easy to get offended by all this, but don't miss the point. The basic mistake was letting these banks get so big that their failure is a threat. They can ask the Congress, okay, we'll let the interest rates go up. You've got all the trillions of dollars to pay off all the depositors of all these banks? If you think the taxpayers got hurt from having less interest, what do you think they're going to get hurt from the taxation that it's going to take to pay the federally insured deposits on these accounts?
You know what you're saying? You're saying that we have to have fraud for our system to survive. This is massive rate rigging, fraud, criminal activity. We have to have it or we're going to go bust.
Greg, I'm not saying anything except explaining to you the situation. I'm not excusing it. I'm not making excuses. I'm just showing you what the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England will tell Congress and will tell the Justice Department, will tell the Parliament. And it's true. What they'll be telling them is true. Yes, in order to save the system, we had to rig the interest rates. There was no other way to save it. And if you go forward with these prosecutions, we won't be able to save the system. And therefore, the people that get hurt by correcting the fraud will be far more and far more serious than the ones hurt by the interest rate rigging. And so what is it you really want us to do? Minimize the harm or maximize the harm? Now, that might sound like I'm making an excuse for them. I'm not. I'm not making any excuse.
I'm with you. I know. You're a good guy.
I'm giving explanation of what the situation appears to be. And so where it went wrong was in the deregulation, because the deregulation brought all of these other consequences. And the only way to correct it at this point is to do what the Financial Times, I think, said the other day: bring back Glass-Steagall. Now, that only corrects it in the long run. There's still the problem of how you get over the short run. And obviously, we can't have the kinds of financial concentration that the deregulation permitted. The size of these banks is unacceptable. And not just their behavior, but their size. You see, if they were a reasonable size, their bad behavior wouldn't matter. They'd let them fail.
Well, maybe we need, here's my question to you. We got to live in a world based on fraud, based on keeping people like Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein in Maseratis and 15,000 square foot houses in the Hamptons. That's the system we have to live in. I say bring on a new system. I do.
I think I've already clarified the question. That's not really the question. And
this is frightening coming from somebody of your stature. You're a PhD in economics. You are former assistant secretary, very high, number 2 basically at Treasury. And you're saying that your assessment, not what you want, this is your assessment. Now, what's going to happen is they're going to go to Congress and say, well, we can let rates rise and the whole system's going to implode. What do you want? And they're going to choose, well, don't let the system implode.
Right.
And so we're just stuck with these basically criminal entities.
Well, what would you do, Greg? Would you say, oh, we'll let the system?
Yes, I would. I would have done it in 2008. Yes. Yes, I would have said, yeah, Lloyd Blankfein, you're fired. Jamie Dimon fired. Ken Lewis fired. Yeah. Oh, and incidentally, you need to talk to my people at the Justice Department. Right. I'm going to cover all the depositors for $6 trillion. That's what we're going to print, $6 trillion. And then we're done. That would have been far cheaper. We spent $16.1 trillion.
It's not that simple. The problem isn't just Jamie Dimon and the Goldman Sachs guy, Lloyd Blankfein. The problem is the deregulation.
Well, then I would have put in regulations after that.
The problem goes back to the Clinton administration. The problem is the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Yes, and the Republicans wanted that too. You got to admit that. Who? They all held hands and sang Kumbaya and said, this is financial innovation.
It doesn't matter who wanted it. This is the problem. The problem is the financial deregulation, which included taking the limits off of debt leverage and a whole variety of other things. Now, why did all this happen? In my opinion, it happened because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and because the Chinese Communist Party has sidelined Mao and changed its approach. And all of a sudden, the Western world no longer needed to compete with communism and socialism. So they didn't need any social welfare. We had all this triumphalism of the neoconservatives, the end of history. American capitalism is vindicated. The Soviets collapsed. Socialism has collapsed. So we don't need all the stuff we had to do to keep our guys from going communist. We can get rid of the welfare state, and we can unfetter capitalism, and it will work even better. And you may remember it was the former Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan, who said that markets are self-regulating.
Yeah.
So all of this came for historical reasons, that the competition that people thought socialist or communist systems offered to capitalism was wiped out by their own failure. So this let hubris unleashed, and the hubris ran away with them. They had this massive deregulation. The deregulation has had all of these consequences. And so firing Blackfein or Jamie Dimon or whatever, or putting them in prison doesn't solve anything, because they were just creatures of this change, this great historic change that was a mistake. And so I think that if you were really on the spot and it was up to you as to whether or not they just paper over the rigging of the interest rates, because that's what the Fed does itself. That's what the Bank of England does. The Fed's always rigging the rates high or low. They rig them high if they're worried about inflation. They rig them low if they're worried about the opposite. And now they got this big banking crisis. So there's nothing unique in the rigging of the rates, except perhaps this overt participation by the banks themselves. But since the policy is designed to achieve that effect, what the banks are doing is not really out of line with the government's policy. And so, again, I'm not excusing fraud or saying it's good for us or that we have to have it. I'm just saying in the conditions that they permitted to arise through all this hubris and mistakes, if you just say, well, okay, we've been rigging it all these years, now we're going to turn our backs and walk away and let the interest rates explode, and we're going to wipe out all the bond portfolios.
It's all based on fraud. Everything, all of our wealth is based on fraud. And aren't we headed for a collapse anyway? Really?
We probably are headed for one anyway, because I don't think they can maintain this forever. How negative can they drive interest rates? If every time they issue another $1.5 trillion in new debt, the prices of the bonds have to go up,
yes.
How long can this go on? How negative can the interest rate get? There has to be a limit. And if there's not a limit that way, there has to be a limit from the fact that so much of the rest of the world is moving away from the use of the dollar. We have the BRICS, Brazil, China, India, Russia, South Africa, moving away from the dollar, settling their international payments with their own currencies.
They're running.
We have the Chinese and the Japanese doing the same thing. So the demand for dollars is dropping because it's not going to be used as much. And that implies the exchange rate of the dollar is going to go down. Now, that means the value of dollar-denominated assets goes down. So how do you keep the price of a bond high when it's got negative interest rates, but the exchange value of the dollar is falling? So that'll blow it up, just that itself. But you can't expect the people who put this system in place in order to try to rescue the serious mistakes from deregulation to say, we're going to blow it up. It's much better for them if some outside factor blows it up, because then they can blame that factor.
Last question.
They'll try to keep it going, even though I expect they probably are aware of these risks. But still, it's living another day is better than dying tonight, and that's probably the way they see it.
Last question. Isn't this at least one big giant nail Another big giant nail in the coffin of collapse. Isn't Libor one big giant nail hammered into the coffin of financial collapse?
Well, I don't know. I see what you mean, but actually the rigging of Libor has helped keep the coffin from being nailed.
But now everybody knows it's rigged, it's phony, it's fake.
Well, they don't understand what I've just told you, and they probably won't, or not many will. And the ones who do are part of the system, and they are committed to keeping it going as long as they can, not just for their own benefits, but to avoid the consequences of having to deal with collapse. You know, they're passing the ship off to the next watch as long as they can. You know, I mean, from Obama's standpoint, it'd be great if this will last until, say, Romney gets in.
Yeah. Paul Craig Roberts, thank you very much for being on USAWatchdog.com to give your appraisal of the Libor rate rigging scandal.
Glad to be with you, Greg.